The land between the lakes sits quietly along the border of Kentucky and Tennessee. A vast and isolated stretch of forest trapped between two enormous bodies of water. As though the land itself had been deliberately cut off from the rest of the world, and while today it is presented as a peaceful national recreation area filled with campsites and hiking trails. Those who have spent enough time there often describe a different experience, entirely one that cannot be found on maps or brochures, one that lingers just beyond explanation. And in the early autumn of 1993, a man named Daniel Harper entered that forest not as a tourist but as someone trying to disappear, carrying with him the weight of debts, mistakes, and a past that was quickly closing in. And the isolation of the forest promised him something. He desperately needed silence, but the moment he stepped out of his truck and approached an old, barely visible service road that cut unnaturally into the trees, he realized that the silence here was not natural, because there were no birds, no insects, not even the sound of wind moving through the leaves, only the dull echo of his own movements, as if the entire forest had paused in anticipation. And it was then, just as he crossed into the tree line, that he noticed something that made him stop. Completely fresh footprints pressed into the dirt road ahead of him, leading deeper into the forest. With no tracks coming back, Daniel remained frozen for several seconds, staring at the footprints as though they might shift or disappear if he looked away. And when he finally crouched down to inspect them more closely, he confirmed what he already feared: they were recent. The edges still soft in the dirt, likely made within the last few hours. Yet something about them felt wrong. The spacing slightly uneven, the depth inconsistent, as if whoever made them had been struggling to walk properly. And despite the unease settling deep in his chest, he chose to follow them, convincing himself, with quiet, hollow reasoning, that it was probably just another hiker who had passed through earlier. But as he moved further along the road, the forest began to change in subtle but disturbing ways, the trees growing closer together, their branches twisting unnaturally overhead and blocking out what little light remained, while the air itself seemed to thicken with each step, pressing against his skin and slowing his breathing. And then came the smell of faint, rotting odor that lingered just at the edge of perception before gradually becoming impossible to ignore. And when Daniel reached out to steady himself against one of the trees, his hand brushed against something carved into the bark, deep gouges etched repeatedly at shoulder height, rough and splintered as though torn by force rather than cut. And before he could fully process what he was seeing, a sudden sound broke the silence behind him, a single, heavy footstep. And when he turned, expecting to see someone standing there, the road was empty. Except now, there was a second set of footprints that had not been there before. Daniel didn't move. His eyes locked onto the second set of footprints as his mind struggled to make sense of their shape. Because, unlike the first, these were larger, deeper, and unnaturally formed, with a heel that extended to far back and toes that spread to widely apart, resembling something that was trying and failing to replicate a human foot. And as a slow, creeping dread settled over him, he took a careful step backward, only to feel his entire body tense when another step echoed behind him at the exact same moment, perfectly synchronized, confirming what he had begun to fear, that something unseen was matching his movements, studying him, mirroring him. And the realization rooted him in place as the forest seemed to close in, the silence now heavy and suffocating, pressing against his chest with every breath. While his instincts screamed at him to run, but something deeper warned him that running might be the worst thing he could do. And instead, with a dry throat and barely controlled voice, he called out, asking who was there. But the question dissolved into the trees without an answer, leaving only a brief, unnatural pause before a sound emerged from somewhere impossibly close, not in front of him, not behind him, but all around him, a voice repeating his words in a hollow, distorted tone that mimicked human speech without understanding it. "Who's there?" And in that moment, as the echo faded into the forest, Daniel understood. Something with absolute certainty, he had not entered the land between the lakes alone. Something had been there long before him, and now it was aware of him. Daniel didn't remember deciding to keep walking, but somehow his body moved forward, despite every instinct urging him to turn back. And as he followed the narrowing road, deeper into the forest, the second set of footprints remained just behind him, never overlapping his own, yet never falling behind, maintaining a distance that felt deliberate, controlled, as if whatever was making them understood exactly how close it needed to stay. And the further he went, the more the environment around him began to feel unnatural. Because it wasn't just the absence of sound, anymore it was the absence of life entirely. No insects crawling across fallen branches, no birds shifting above. Not even the distant movement of water, despite the lake surrounding the entire region. And after what felt like far longer than it should have taken, the trees ahead began to thin slightly, revealing something that shouldn't have been there. At all, a clearing that looked less like a natural break in the forest and more like something forced into existence. And at its center stood the remains of what appeared to be an old structure, partially collapsed and consumed by time. Its wooden frame darkened and rotting, yet still standing just enough to suggest that it had once been lived in. And as Daniel stepped closer, his eyes scanned the ground instinctively, and that's when he noticed that the original footprints he had been following didn't stop at the edge of the clearing. They led directly inside. The structure was smaller than it first appeared. It's more like a crude cabin than a proper house. Its walls splintered and warped as though they had been exposed to decades of neglect. And yet there was something unsettling about the way it still stood, as if it hadn't been abandoned entirely, but simply left waiting. And Daniel hesitated at the edge of the doorway, his eyes adjusting to the darkness inside, while the smell of decay grew stronger with each passing second. Thick and suffocating now. And although every rational part of him told him to leave, to turn around and get back to his truck before whatever was following him decided to close the distance. Something else, something quieter but far more persuasive, chimned forward. And when he finally stepped inside, the temperature seemed to drop instantly. The air colder and heavier, carrying with it a stillness that felt almost unnatural. And the interior revealed only fragments of what the cabin once was. Broken furniture scattered across the floor, remnants of old fabric hanging from rusted nails, and deep scratches carved into the wooden walls in patterns that made no immediate sense, repeating again and again at varying heights, as though something had paced within this confined space for a very long time. And then, near the far corner of the room, Daniel noticed something that made him stop completely: a pile of bones, partially hidden beneath debris, too large and too numerous to belong to a single animal. And before he could step closer to examine them, a sound came from just outside the cabin. Slow, deliberate. Circling, Daniel backed away from the bones instinctively, his breathing now shallow and uneven as the sound outside continued to move around the cabin in a slow, measured pattern, each step heavy enough to be heard clearly through the thin, rotting walls, yet strangely controlled, as though whatever was making the noise was intentionally allowing itself to be heard. And as he stood there, frozen between the doorway and the far corner of the room, he realized something that made his stomach drop. The second set of footprints had stopped appearing behind him the moment he entered the clearing, meaning whatever had been following him was no longer leaving tracks at all. And the implications of that thought settled over him like a weight, because it meant that whatever was out there didn't need to hide anymore. And as the circling sound slowed, then stopped completely, just beyond the cabin wall, the silence that followed felt even worse than the noise, stretching on just long enough to become unbearable before it was broken by something else entirely: a soft scraping sound against the wood, low at first, then gradually rising higher, as though something outside was dragging its hand door, something like a hand slowly up the exterior wall. Testing it, feeling it, learning its shape, and then, without warning, the movement stopped, directly beside the doorway and in the stillness that followed. Daniel realized he could hear something else now, something much closer than before breathing. Not his own, but something deeper, heavier, spave far too close to the entrance. Daniel didn't realize he had stopped breathing until his chest began to ache. The sound of that slow, heavy breathing just beyond the doorway, holding him in place as though his body no longer fully belonged to him. And every instinct told him not to move, not to make a sound, because whatever stood outside the cabin was no longer hiding its presence. And yet, it hadn't entered, which somehow made the situation far worse, because it suggested intention, patience, something that understood fear and knew how to stretch it. And as seconds dragged into what felt like minutes, the breathing abruptly stopped, replaced by a silence so complete it felt unnatural even in that place. And it was only then that Daniel found himself able to move again, his legs unsteady as he shifted his weight and forced himself to look toward the doorway, almost accepting that something would be standing there. But the entrance remained empty, revealing only the dim outline of the clearing beyond. And for a brief moment, he considered running. But something pulled his attention back inside the cabin, back toward the pile of bones in the far corner, because now, with the silence pressing in around him, he could see them more clearly. And what he had first taken for animal remains began to reveal shapes that were disturbingly familiar. Elongated fragments that resembled ribs, curved structures too symmetrical to be anything else. And as realization settled slowly into his mind, Daniel understood something that made the air feel even colder. Those bones didn't belong to animals, at least not entirely. The longer Daniel looked, the more details began to emerge from the pile. Fragments of clothing tangled among the remains, faded fabric clinging to what had once been part of a sleeve, and something else, something smaller half, buried beneath the larger bones. And as he moved closer, despite the growing sense of dread tightening in his chest, he reached down carefully and brushed aside debris until the object came into view, revealing what appeared to be a child's shoe. Worn and dirt-stained, but unmistakably small, and the sight of it sent a sharp, immediate chill through him, because it confirmed what he had already begun to suspect, that whatever had happened here had not been quick, and it had not been limited to a single victim. And before he could fully process that thought, his attention shifted to the walls again, too. The deep scratches that covered nearly every surface. And now, standing closer, he could see that they weren't random at all, but layered over one another in frantic, overlapping patterns, as if something had been trapped inside this cabin at some point. Something large enough to reach every wall, something desperate enough to tear at the wood repeatedly. And then, just as that realization began to take shape, another sound broke the silence, this time from above him, a faint creak from the ceiling, followed by the subtle shift of weight in the space just overhead, as though something had been there the entire time, waiting. Daniel's head tilted upward slowly, his movements cautious and deliberate as his eyes adjusted to the darkness gathering along the ceiling beams. And at first, there was nothing, only shadow and the uneven structure of the cabin itself. But then something shifted, subtle enough that he might have missed it if he had blinked. A shape pulling slightly away from the darkness rather than emerging from it. And as his vision focused, the outline began to form into something that made his entire body lock in place, because whatever clung to the upper corner of the cabin was not human, its limbs too long, bent at unnatural angles as they gripped the wood with a stillness that suggested control rather than strain. And its head, if it could be called that, hung slightly forward, just enough for him to see the faint suggestion of a face, though the details refused to fully resolve. As though his mind couldn't or wouldn't process them, and for a moment, Neither of them moved, the silence stretching into something unbearable, until finally, with a slow, deliberate motion, the thing shifted its weight along the beam, the wood creaking softly beneath it, and then, in a voice that sounded almost human, but not quite right, it spoke again, repeating the same hollow words from the forest. "Who's there?" And this time, there was no distance between them, no trees, no illusion of space, only a few feet of air separating Daniel from something that had been watching him long before he ever stepped into the land. Between the lakes, Daniel didn't remember deciding to move. Only that one moment, he was staring up at the thing clinging to the ceiling, and the next, his body had already reacted, stumbling backward toward the doorway as a sudden, overwhelming instinct took control, and the moment his foot crossed the threshold of the cabin, the stillness behind him broke with a violent crack as something heavy dropped from above, striking the wooden floor with enough force to splinter it, and that sound alone was enough to send him running without looking back, his feet hitting the dirt outside as he pushed himself forward into the clearing, the cold air burning his lungs. As the silence of the forest shattered into something far worse, the unmistakable sound of pursuit. Fast, erratic movement tearing through the undergrowth behind him. Far too close, far too heavy to be anything human. And as he reached the edge of the trees, he risked a glance over his shoulder, just long enough to see a shape emerge from the cabin doorway. Its body low and unnatural as it moved with a disturbing combination of speed and control. Its limbs bending in ways that didn't match the structure of any animal he had ever seen. And the moment its head lifted slightly, catching his movement, Daniel felt something shift in the air itself, as if the distance between them had suddenly become irrelevant, and without hesitation, he turned back and ran deeper into the forest, knowing with absolute certainty that whatever was behind him was no longer watching. It was hunting. The forest that had once felt silent now seemed alive with movement. Branches snapping and leaves tearing under the weight of something following him at a speed he couldn't match. And no matter how fast he pushed himself, the sound remained close to close, never gaining fully but never falling behind, as though it was pacing him, controlling the distance just as it had before. And Daniel's breathing became ragged as panic began to take over, his thoughts collapsing into fragments as he tried to remember the way back, the road, the truck, anything that could lead him out of this place. But the deeper he ran, the more unfamiliar everything became, the trees blending together into an endless maze that offered no direction, no escape. And then, without warning, the sound behind him stopped completely, cutting off so abruptly that it forced him to slow, his body resisting the silence now as much as it had feared the noise. And for a brief, dangerous moment, he wondered if he had lost it, if somehow he had managed to outrun whatever had been chasing him. But that thought barely had time to form before something moved to his left, not behind him this time, but beside him, keeping pace just out of sight, weaving between the trees with a precision that made it clear this was no random pursuit. And as Daniel turned his head slightly, trying to catch even a glimpse of it, a voice emerged again from the darkness, closer than ever before, matching his breath, matching his pace, whispering in that same broken tone, "Who's there?" By the time Daniel saw the road again, he wasn't sure if it was the same one he had entered from or something else entirely. But the sight of open ground ahead was enough to push him forward with what little strength he had left, his legs barely responding as exhaustion and terror blurred together. And as he stumbled onto the dirt path, he allowed himself the briefest moment of relief, hoping that he had finally created enough distance to escape. But the moment he slowed, the forest behind him went completely still, and that stillness carried a weight that felt deliberate, final, as though something had decided the chase was over. And before he could fully understand what that meant, a sound came from ahead of him this time, not from the trees, but from the road itself a slow, deliberate step, pressing into the dirt just a few yards in front of him. And when Daniel's eyes dropped to the ground, his blood ran cold, because a fresh footprint appeared where nothing had been before, forming slowly as if something invisible was standing there, blocking his path. And then another step followed, and another, each one materializing closer, until the distance between them was almost nothing. And in the suffocating silence that followed, Daniel realized the truth he had been trying to outrun since the moment he entered the forest. This was never a chase. It was a containment, and wherever this road led, it wasn't out. Daniel couldn't move, his body locked in place as the invisible presence ahead of him continued to close the distance, each step pressing into the dirt road with a slow, deliberate weight that made the ground itself seem to respond. And although he still couldn't see, it couldn't fully comprehend what stood in front of him. His mind began to fill in the gaps in ways he couldn't control, constructing something tall, something wrong, something that didn't belong to the natural world. And as the final step formed just a few feet away, the air between them seemed to shift, growing colder, heavier, as though the space itself was being occupied by something vast and unnatural. And then, without warning, the illusion broke, not completely, but just enough for a fraction of a second. Daniel saw it, not clearly, not fully, but enough to understand the shape of what had been following him, a towering figure hunched unnaturally forward, its limbs elongated and bent at angles that suggested both strength and instability, its surface indistinct, almost blending into the darkness around it, except for one detail that remained horribly clear: its face, or at least the suggestion of one stretched into something that resembled a human expression but lacked any true emotion. And as quickly as it appeared, the image seemed to collapse back into nothingness, leaving only the pressure of its presence and the unbearable certainty that it was now standing directly in front of him. Daniel's mind struggled to hold on to what he had just seen, the image slipping away even as he tried to focus on it, as though whatever stood before him resisted being understood, and the longer he stared, the more unstable the space around it seemed to become, the edges of its form blurring into the surrounding darkness, until it was once again nothing more than an absence in the world rather than a visible presence. And then, slowly, the voice returned, closer than ever before, no longer echoing from the trees or mimicking from a distance, but forming directly in front of him, layered and uneven as if multiple attempts at speech were overlapping each other. "Who's there?" And this time, there was something different in the tone, something almost curious, as though it was no longer simply repeating the phrase, but trying to understand it, trying to assign meaning to sounds it had learned, but never truly grasped. Daniel felt something inside him begin to fracture as the realization settled in, that this thing wasn't just hunting him, it was studying him, learning from him, adapting in real time. And as that thought took hold, another followed, far more terrifying than the first. Because if it could learn how to speak, how long would it take before it learned how to become something else entirely? Something that could move freely beyond this place. Something that wouldn't need the forest or the silence or the isolation to exist. And in that moment, Daniel understood that whatever this was, it wasn't trapped here. It was waiting. Asterisk. No one knows exactly what happened to Daniel Harper after that night, because his truck was later found abandoned near the edge of the forest. The keys still inside, the door left slightly open, as though he had intended to return at any moment, and search teams combed through the area for days, covering miles of terrain without finding a single trace of him. No footprints, no clothing, nothing that suggested where he had gone or what had taken him. And officially, his disappearance was classified as just another missing person case, one of many that occur in remote wilderness areas each year, easily explained away by accidents, disorientation, or the simple danger of getting lost. But those explanations don't account for what some of the searchers later reported. Brief moments deep in the forest where the silence would fall to. Suddenly, too completely, where the air would feel unnaturally heavy. And more than once, individuals claimed to hear something moving just out of sight, keeping pace with them, stopping when they stopped. And in at least one account, a voice was heard faint, distorted, and unmistakably human calling out from somewhere in the trees, asking the same question over and over again in a tone that didn't quite understand the words it was using. Who's there? Sta. And even now, long after the case has been forgotten, there are still those who avoid certain roads within the land between the lakes, not because of what has been proven to exist there, but because of what might still be learning, still waiting, just beyond the edge of sight.